Like the image of the late Queen Elizabeth II on Great Britain, America's 16th president is almost omnipresent. Abraham Lincoln's bearded profile is so much a part of our consciousness, from the pennies in a child's piggy bank to the $5 bill to highway signs and license plates. He's almost impossible to view as a real person. But he was. Very real. And knowing he was a mortal like you and me leads to so many questions. But perhaps the biggest was his relationship with God. Tonight, a New York Times best-selling author who believes he has some answers about Abraham Lincoln's lifelong wrestling match with the Almighty. In the end, who won? We'll talk with author Stephen Mansfield in just a moment. Stay with us. What did Abraham Lincoln pray for? Who did he pray for? Who did he pray to? When his wife experienced chronic bouts of despair and depression, that's Mary Lincoln, what did he do? When all but one of his children died before they reached adulthood, what did he do? When the Civil War, claimed tens of thousands of young men on his watch, where did he turn? Author Stephen Mansfield has chronicled the lives of many of history's great figures, but it's his attempt to go deep into Abraham Lincoln's soul that may have been the most challenging writing exercise yet for him. We'll talk with Stephen in just a minute, but first, I want you to watch this.
Our history in America has been told from such a secular perspective that my complaint is not so much that just faith is omitted, but the drama of their lives, the great dark nights of the soul, and the agony and the grittiness out of which their politics and their greatness comes. I mean, Lincoln suffered. He fought for his faith, and then his faith undergirded almost every major thing that he did. If you take his faith away, it's not just that it's secular. It doesn't have the poetry, it doesn't have the drama, it doesn't have the meaning, it doesn't have the blood and the mud and the grit that a human life has. So I want them to see that and reclaim that in this particular story. But there's one other thing, and that is that I think Lincoln's battle with God is so poignant and so human that I want them to feel the great drama. There's not much that Lincoln felt in his various stages of faith that I haven't felt, that you probably haven't felt. Anybody watching hasn't felt, or those who read the book. I want them to feel it. I want them to say, I'm not alone in having questions, I'm not alone in battling, I'm not alone in my grief. This is human, this is real, and greatness can still arise from it on the other side.
Lincoln's battle with God. Stephen Mansfield, welcome to State of Independence. Let me first ask you whether your research about Lincoln's relationship with God changed your initial understanding, and if so, how?
It certainly did change my understanding. I obviously revered Lincoln, loved him for everything from the humor to the great speeches, but I hadn't realized the agony of his soul related to faith. He suffered deaths throughout his life. He battled debilitating depression. His friends often stood suicide watch. And so Lincoln's faith was hard won. He had to battle through a season of atheism and what they called at the time infidelity. He had to battle through being offended with churches and clergy in the South who were defending slavery, something he hated. And so the fact that he arrived as one of our most, if not the most spiritual president we've ever had, is a result of a battle that I just felt like I had to tell. But it changed me, and it was a privilege to write it.
He's such a fascinating person to study. I had the great privilege the great blessing to work in the White House for an American president, and I know that from just the time that I was there working for the president of the United States, how hard that job is. It's a very hard job, a very lonely job, certainly for the person at the top who has to make the really hard decisions that the rest of us don't get to see. I can only imagine that it was even harder for Abraham Lincoln back in his time when the country was divided and was at war with itself. And then he had to make those hard decisions. Clearly the one we all remember is the Emancipation Proclamation, if you're a person of color as I am, that becomes certainly the most important decision that he made during the course of his presidency for you, if you happen to be black like I am. But what we don't know is you're talking about Lincoln as a spiritual man. Was this a spiritual decision, or was this a political decision, or was it a mixture of the two? Because at the end of the day, he had to be able to count votes. He had to be able to know who was going to be on his side, who was going to support him. If you're going to pass an amendment, for instance, you've got to have legislative support for that. So you need people to be on your side. And so, tell me how he was able to, as best you understand it, deal with what he thought spiritually was the right thing to do with what politically he thought he needed to do.
Well, I think the best example is what you've already mentioned, and that's the Emancipation Proclamation. We're grateful that he issued it. 1863, January 1, it's issued. It changes American history. What most people don't know is that Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation out of a covenant he had made with God. He told his cabinet, and several people recorded the conversation, that he had decided if they won certain battles, if the North won certain battles, that he would see that as God sort of signing off on his side of the covenant, and that Abraham Lincoln then would issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This was recorded by Gideon Welles and other members of the cabinet. It's very well established. It's not mentioned much in the textbooks, obviously, because it's a religious side of Lincoln. But there's an example of what he was like in the White House. He never joined a church. He never subscribed to a creed. He attended church. He kept a Bible on his desk to talk to almost all his visitors about what he was reading in Scripture.
And he would quote Scripture as well in his speeches.
He would very often. And by the way, his speeches are just filled with Scripture. But I think the real seminal moment is where Abraham Lincoln literally makes a covenant with God. You help us win these two battles, and I will issue this declaration, this emancipation, and I will consider that it is your will, despite the political oppositions. I think that tells us what the man was like in the White House.
Now, you talked a little bit about the fact that there was a season where maybe he didn't believe, a season of unbelief or atheism, which could have been driven by being angry at God, as he may have been. His life was not easy. His father was not a very kind person to him, as I understand it. And he didn't grow up in a family with means, so he was handicapped from that standpoint. He wasn't the son of a wealthy person, so he didn't have an easy and clear path to elected office. To add to it, of course, he was what was probably then freakishly tall, at 6 feet 4 inches. I think he was about 6'4".
Yes.
But he was a lot taller than everybody else. And very slender, which would made him stand out. And not being somebody of means, he didn't have. I'm guessing he just didn't have the outward appearance of a well-groomed person. Somebody who'd been to fine schools and who ate on fine china and who had manners and the like. I'm guessing that he would not have come across that way to people who met him.
No, he came across very rough. They called him an ape. He had long arms and a gangly body and a haggard face. But you put your finger right on it. The thing that turned him off to faith, though, in his early childhood, he showed a real interest in religion and even would mimic preachers and do it so powerfully people would come to hear him, is that his parents were very caught up in the Second Great Awakening. This is this rough revival that happens on the frontier with a lot of actions and people flipping around and rolling on the ground and so on. But it seems to have had a real sincere part. Well, his father, as you've said, both his parents very caught up in this revival, almost to an extreme degree, but his father was very abusive to Abraham. In fact, I'll tell you that once Abraham Lincoln made a speech, it's one I'm sure in heaven he's not that proud of, where he actually spoke to ex-slaves as though he knew what slavery was because of the way his father treated him. Not really wise, but that just shows how much suffering he thought he endured. His father was physically abusive, and then would turn right around and be hyper-religious and extreme with the revival. Well, this turned Abraham off to religion. So he went through a season of what they called at the time infidelity. He became the village atheist. He carried a Bible in New Salem, around the streets of New Salem, just to argue against it. And what really changed is that he then went to Springfield and he began to get acquainted with Christians who knew how to give a reason for the hope that lay within them. They were well read, they were articulate, they were well studied, and they countered the sort of frontier liberalism that Abraham Lincoln had consumed and had absorbed. So this began a turn, this began a change. And so when people say what was Lincoln's faith, you almost have to ask, well, what season of his life are we talking about?
Yeah.
Because he had 2 or 3 different phases.
Yeah, and also he had a great sadness. So once he became an adult, mixed in with some of the success he had was great sadness with the loss of. I mean, the one surviving boy, of course, went on to do great things in life and business, but he lost. Was it 2 boys along the way? 2 sons.
He lost 2 boys, yes. And when he was in the White House, which is the time we're kind of focusing on, he lost, I think, picture this now, not only will there be 700,000 deaths during his administration, no other president has had that kind of devastation. And the historians now say American Civil War, 700,000 deaths. But he loses a son who dies horribly, probably of tuberculosis, and it takes almost 2 months. So the suffering and the agony is horrible. Well, now Mary Todd Lincoln was a little bit emotionally imbalanced. And when she grieved for one of her sons, again, as you say, she lost 2, she would howl long into the night. The White House would be filled with the screams of this grieving woman. And here Abraham's trying to deal with the war. He's trying to deal with his wife, who is becoming unhinged. And in addition to that, he was a man who battled his own battles with depression. As I say, friends had to stay on suicide watch a number of times. But one friend said that he dripped melancholy as he walked. So the Abraham Lincoln's White House years, though they've got their sweetness and their beauty and glorious speeches and the Gettysburg Address and things of that nature, they are agonizing to him. And he reached out to God. He reached for God. And I think that's what kept him from literally going over the edge emotionally and mentally.
Wow. So you have this thing where here you have this president who uses scripture in such a mighty way in his speeches, and then comes to a strong personal faith with God. But at the same time, he's not a member of a church. He doesn't say, well, I'm going to join First Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., or an Episcopal church or someplace. He doesn't join the church. Do you think it's because to him, it wasn't a matter of the institution, it was a matter of the personal relationship? Or do you think he might have also thought to himself, well, it becomes spectacle if now as President of the United States, I attend church every Sunday, that's a spectacle, and people will come there to not worship, but to try to bend my ear for 5 or 10 minutes on whatever matter it is they care about. And so
I think it's both. There's no question there was spectacle. He actually attended some churches where some people stood up and rebuked him right during the service. Because again, in Washington, D.C. at that time, you had both Southern sympathizers and Northern sympathizers. He once had to have a Marine Guard come and guard him because he was being molested basically in church. But I'll tell you, the thing about Abraham Lincoln is that he was really offended by the man-made side of religion. I believe he loved God. I believe he was making a journey towards receiving Jesus in a deep and personal way as the Son of the living God. But he was offended by the man-made side of religion. We know from his writings and from speeches that he made that he got upset when a friend of his, a politician, was ostracized for dancing. He got offended when they would kick people out for drinking or something of that nature. He got offended with the Southern clergy because they defended slavery. But I'll tell you, there's some sweet moments. Not only did Lincoln attend New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in D.C., though he never joined, but one of the sweetest moments I know, or the sweetest habits that I know of his during the Civil War, is he would sneak across Lafayette Park to a church you know well because you were in the first Bush administration, St. John's Church, Church of the Presidents. Yep. He would sneak over there. The pastor would allow Abraham to go into his office, and Lincoln would sit in that pastor's office with the door open and listen to intercessory prayer meetings that would be going on in the next room. Lincoln was encouraged to hear people praying to God, asking for God's mercy, asking for God's healing for the nation. And so he would sneak over, wouldn't make an appearance. They didn't know he was there, but this is recorded a number of times by his guards and by that pastor. And that's sweet to me. That means that he's a man who desperately needs encouragement, doesn't want to be intrusive, but is buoyed by the prayers of the saints. And he's not the only one who's ever felt that in the world history, but it's sweet to me that he was in that state during the war.
Frederick Douglass was not always pleased with him. Obviously, Frederick Douglass knew the actual pain of slavery. He had been able to escape it as a younger man, but was so passionate in his defense of the need for bringing slavery to an end. And he was not always an ally of President Lincoln's. I guess there was some talk that the president, while he was not for slavery and thought that it ought to be ended as an institution, didn't necessarily ascribe to the notion that people of color were equal to the majority society at the time. And that was the flip side of that, which certainly people of color were well aware. So there were lots of people, lots of abolitionists who, on the one hand, thought that slavery was an abomination as an institution, but nonetheless didn't see people of color as their equals, as such, with the same rights to be able to vote and so on and so forth.
That's exactly. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I want to hear your sense.
That's exactly where Lincoln was. This is confusing to some people. He is, on the one hand, the great emancipator. He believed that African Americans ought to be free, that the slaves ought to be free. At the same time, he had questions about whether they could survive in a free society, whether they were capable, as you say, whether they were equal, which of course is an unfair thing. You keep a people in slavery and then you insist on comparing them to educated, wealthy, white society. Hey, will they be able to function? It was an unfair comparison. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that he was in favor of a Back to Africa movement in a good number of his years. He wanted the slaves free, but he also didn't think they could survive and function in the United States. So Lincoln is a frustrating mixture. Lincoln is a man who I think it's certainly fine to honor him as the emancipator and honor him for the great things that he did. There's no question he helped rescue this country from the downward spiral it was in. However, he was not a modern equality of all men, humanity kind of thinker. He did not think that way. And so it's probably good that other people were involved in Reconstruction and other people took the lead with what our nation became. He played his role. He played it well. He had many of the right values. But to try to portray him as a man who was the most highest form of lover and respecter of Black America is not quite right either, as you're saying.
Yeah. I suppose that's part of why Frederick Douglass was not so pleased so much of the time. Lincoln also had dreams. As I understand it, he had a dream about his own death. Is that true?
It's absolutely true. He recounted it to many people. This is why I say Lincoln was, without question, our most spiritual president. I'd maybe to say most spiritual is unfair, but he had premonitions, he had dreams, he prayed, and he would have God would answer in signs. He talked about this openly, but he had a dream not too long before his death where he awoke and people were weeping in the White House. And he, as a character in his own dream, went to someone and said, what is going on? What has happened here? And someone said to him, the president's been killed. And that was not long before his death. He also had other odd things happen. He woke up and looked in a mirror split by a door in some way that we don't 100% understand. And he saw himself, his face split right down the middle by the mirror. Somehow maybe a mirror on a door had been turned inward on another mirror. You know how that can happen. And he saw that as a sign of his death and that he was being split or divided in some way. He had these things all the time throughout his life, and it mixed in with his grief, it mixed in with his depression, but it also mixed in with his unshakable faith in God in his latter years. So these were things that he did not hesitate to talk about openly, by the way. An ambassador would come in from France and he would say, by the way, I had a dream last night. An ambassador from France would go back and tell his staff, well, who are we dealing with here? This is the most unusual conversation I've ever had with a statesman. But I think maybe from this distance, we can be proud that Lincoln was at least open about these matters. So, we can know about them and see the titanic struggle in his soul.
Well, like a good forensic detective, Stephen Mansfield scraped the scenes of Abraham Lincoln's life for his spiritual DNA. More with him in a minute.
Learn more about Joe Watkins and the mission of this program at joewatkins.net. And tell Joe what you thought about today's program in the comment box.
His name is Stephen Mansfield. The book, Lincoln's Battle with God, is published by Thomas Nelson and is available at Amazon.com. Stephen, I want to ask you about how to read Lincoln. When you read a speech loaded with scripture text and thick with Christian doctrine, is this a politician who knows his audience? Is he just speaking in the common dialect of his time?
There's no question that he is, but the fact that he did it far more than other politicians who tended to drain that kind of content out is revealing. And one of the most important stories that shows that he really was speaking the courage of his convictions. After he gave the famous second inaugural address, which is one of the greatest American political sermons, I was just at the Lincoln Memorial here in Washington, D.C., and just decided to read it again standing there because it's such a powerful statement of theology. And when Lincoln had given it, by the way, he had come to the conclusion that the war was judgment from God on both sides for the mistreatment of the black man. And Lincoln said as much in that speech. Afterward, he was asked by a friend, do you think the public will like this speech? And he said, I think these are powerful words. He said, probably not, because people do not like being shown the gap between themselves and God.
Wow.
So think about it now. This is what Lincoln believed he was doing in the second inaugural address, showing people, North and South, the gap between themselves and God. So he was seeing himself as, small p prophet. That's what prophets do, is plead God's case. And that's what he was doing.
There's some that say that John Wilkes Booth was actually at that second address. I don't know if it's true or not, but there have been some that have said that Booth was actually there listening to that address and not far away.
Yeah, it's the historians identify him actually in photographs of that moment. Believe it or not, we have photographs of that, and they identify him there. So he's hearing him give those words, then shoots the man within a matter of weeks. So I think Lincoln was being political to some degree. You definitely use scripture, but he went beyond anyone else. For example, one of his greatest speeches, as you know, is called A House Divided. Well, that's straight from scripture. And so he did things that others did not do. But the second inaugural, I think, really shows his willingness to risk political ire for the sake of pleading God's case as he understood it. And I think that's perhaps the greatest side of his legacy.
I have so many questions about Lincoln. I've got a couple of minutes left with you, and so I'm going to try to fit two questions in. The first one is, I wish we had tape recorders back then, because I would love to know what he sounded like. Did he have a deep voice, or did he have a higher pitched voice? Did he speak with a Midwestern accent or a Southern accent? I'm at a loss as to what he sounded like. Did he sound slightly British? I'm suspecting some people did, probably certainly in the early 1800s. Do you have any sense of that?
We have descriptions from people who knew the theater, knew how to describe voices well. And Lincoln was known to be a powerful speaker in his content and in the poetry of his speaking, but his voice was slightly high, particularly for his size, and he definitely had kind of a Kentucky, Illinois frontier accent that had never left him. So picture someone who sounds a little bit Midwestern twang. His voice is a little high for his size, but then as soon as people get over that, and by the way, his critics would talk about that all the time, as soon as people got beyond that, the brilliance of his thought, the poetry, the allusions to literature and poetry and so on, he would almost always win the day. And this had been learned on the frontier as he learned how to run for office and how to convince in the court, in the circuit courts that he appeared in. This again was a skill he honed. Yeah. But yes, I think that's the best we have. I'm looking forward to, if he's in heaven, I'm looking forward to meeting him there, asking him a whole bunch of questions.
Well, Stephen Mansfield, as with so many other subjects from Arthur Guinness to George W. Bush, you've discovered the side of Lincoln that isn't always included in our modern understanding of the face on the penny. But Lincoln's life is an example, especially for suffering people, that there is hope in God. Stephen, I hope you'll come back again on this program soon. And I'm so grateful that you were with us today. Thanks.
I would love to. It's a privilege to be with you, Joe.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I'll be right back with our great producer, Jeff Coleman.
You're watching Joe Watkins' State of Independence on Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Share your comments about today's program in the comment box at joewatkins.org.
And now let's talk to our great producer, Jeff Coleman.
I think it's so important that when we have guests on that we speak honestly about these historical figures. That, you know, we like quotes. People have Kennedy quotes and Reagan quotes and Lincoln quotes and Washington quotes on their walls, or they're sharing them on social media. But those quotes are a reflection of maybe a moment in time. And it doesn't capture, Joe, does it, the complexity of a person's life?
Yeah. Well, he just pointed out the complexity of Lincoln, on the one hand being the great emancipator, but on the other hand, you know, not thinking that people of color were his equal or were able to survive in our society.
Right.
So he supported a Back to Africa movement, you know, which I'm sure most people are not aware of.
Which would be fairly controversial today,
very
wouldn't
controversial
it?
today,
You know, When you're looking at Lincoln, you have to almost hop in the car with him, and you want to talk to him about how did he arrive at a decision. You know, why did you think that? Why did you say that at this moment in time? What were the pressures? So when we look at presidents in particular, I think going back to original historical documents and their friends and all that, you still have a murky picture.
Yeah.
So when we're putting politicians on a pedestal, we've got to be very careful, I think, of how we represent their heroics. They are heroes, maybe for one act, but the rest of their life might have been pretty complicated.
Right. Well, I'm sure that it must have felt terrible the whole time that he was president, because, you know, normally you think to yourself, somebody wins the presidency and that's a wonderful time. There are going to be lots of hard times, but at least there's celebration. You're in the White House. He gets in the White House, the country's torn apart, there's a war, a civil war, people are dying. I mean, 700,000 people died under his watch, and that's sad, that's really sad.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the country's at war with itself, and it's on his watch to bring it together, and it's not for certain that he's gonna succeed in bringing it together.
And the story doesn't have an ending that is easily understood.
Yeah.
You have this tragedy at the end, but out of it comes a second birth, right, for the country. And we are here in large part because of him.
Yeah.
Irony of it all.
Yeah. Wow, what a story.
What a story.
Yeah.
And a great author.
Yeah, Steve Mansfield's great. President Abraham Lincoln's life was buffeted by tragedy and heartache. There were great political and military triumphs, but much of his life was under the dark clouds of providence. Maybe that's where I'm finding you tonight. If it is, then Lincoln's example of wrestling with God until you can finally know him, see him, and be loved by him should be an encouragement. Don't give up that fight. Thanks to Stephen Mansfield for sharing his work with us, and thanks for you for sitting at this table with me. Let me know if this conversation on Abraham Lincoln encouraged you as much as it did me, and with a note in the comment box at joewatkins.org. From America's first capital, Philadelphia, I'm Joe Watkins. For Jeff Coleman and the team here at Lighthouse TV, thanks so much for watching. God willing, I'll see you next week. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to go back in time and actually see people as they were, to see Lincoln as he was?
Those are the kind of dreams I have. You know, like walking in a room and seeing an event. Joe Watkins' State of Independence is a production of Lighthouse TV, positively different. Made possible in part because of the support of viewers like you.